So welcome to our DotNetNuke Explained module development webinar, basic module development webinar. My name is Chris Hammond. I'm the Director of Training Programs here with DotNetNuke Corporation. We're going to be talking to you today about basic module development. We'll talk about how you can get set up and running in your development, talk about some of the tools that are necessary to do module development. Today's web seminar is part of our free DotNetNuke Explained series. We started out with 4 webinars in the series. We've actually added 2 additional ones. Previously, we've offered an installation, a basic site administration, and then last week we did a basic skinning webinar. And the recordings are available for all 3 of those. We are recording today's session, so the recording will be made available later on today. You'll get access to that via a link in an email sometime tomorrow with information about the recording as well as information about the 2 upcoming seminars. So we're going to have an upgrading DotNetNuke web seminar on May 2nd, and then we're going to have a content editor seminar on May 22nd, where we talk about how users can maintain, edit, and update content within DotNetNuke. We don't currently have the registration links for those 2 seminars up, but they will be up later today, and we'll have that information in the email that goes out to you guys so you can sign up for those as well. As with the previous seminars, those will be recorded. You'll be able to come back and watch the recordings for those after they're delivered live. Now for today's webinar, we're going to be going through and talking about module development. Now the very first thing on the agenda here is a URL. It's a shortcut URL to bit.ly/moduledev. Now that is all lowercase, and what that'll send you to is my latest blog post on DotNetNuke.com. Now within that blog post I talk about a number of different things that we're going to cover in the seminar today, but I also point you to a variety of URLs that I'll reference here within the web seminar. So if you don't catch the URLs here when we're going through this live, check out that blog post. It has information that we're going to be covering today, points you to instructions on how we set up our development environment. I'm going to give you an overview of my development environment, but we're not going to go through the installation process for that because we've already covered our install webinar, and we could spend an hour just talking about our environment. So I'll give you an overview of that, but for the instructions on how to set up your development environment, check out that shortcut URL in the latest blog post. So we're going to talk about our development approach, we're going to talk about our environment, and then I'm going to talk to you about project templates and 2 project templates that we have available. I'm going to show you how to install those and utilize those to create a project. Within that project in Visual Studio, we'll be able to package our module, and then we'll be able to install the module into our DotNetNuke development environment. And then after that, we'll have time for Q&A towards the end of the session. Now, I won't be answering questions during the session. I will answer them after I'm done with the presentation, though, so I can keep on track with the topics that we want to cover here this morning. So feel free to type any questions that you have during the process here. I'll just try to address those, like I said, afterwards. So first thing we're going to do is talk about some development approaches. There's essentially 2 approaches to module development within DotNetNuke. There are other approaches as well, but the 2 standard methods are website project and web application projects. Now a website project actually requires that you open up DotNetNuke, the full website, within Visual Studio. This actually opens up a lot of different resources, requires a lot of the DotNetNuke code to be open. And when you go through and you start creating modules, the benefits of that, you can create a module that just has an ASCX file, doesn't have to have any code behind, doesn't have a DLL. It's very easy to open up, make changes to, save those changes, and they're immediately available. Kind of the downfalls of that, or the advantages to the web application project model, and that's the approach we're going to take. Using WAP, we have an individual project for each of our modules, and we'll see that as we go through the process here this morning. Within those individual projects, we can compile each module into a single DLL. That allows us to obfuscate our code. So if you want to obfuscate the code, make it harder for people to try to decompile the code, to get access to your code, you can do so using the WAP approach. It is very easy to debug our modules. Using the templates that we're going to look at, it's very easy to package and distribute our modules. And following this approach also makes it easy to have multiple developers working on individual projects or individual modules. Using the WSP or the website project approach, it becomes difficult if you have a group of developers trying to work on an individual module when you have the module embedded and opened up within the DotNetNuke website as part of your project. So we'll talk more about the environment here in a second, see how we have DNN set up and how we're going to be able to utilize that. So with the WAP approach or the web application project approach, each developer is going to have their own unique DotNetNuke installation. Now that's going to be set up locally on their local server or their local machine, laptop, desktop, whatever the case may be. So they're going to have their own install. They're also going to have their own database. What that allows is as developers are making changes and doing customizations, they don't step on each other's toes. They don't cause problems with another person's installation, another person's development. So we are going to be setting up, or I already have DotNetNuke set up locally. I'm running DotNetNuke version 6.1.5, which was just released a couple of weeks ago. I have DotNetNuke Professional Edition installed. You can do module development against Community Edition, Professional Edition, or Enterprise Edition. And you can actually deploy modules that are developed against any of those editions across the edition. So you're not, if I develop against Professional Edition, I'm not stuck utilizing that module only on Professional Edition. Now I do have a local database or a local SQL server running, and I already have the database up and DotNetNuke installed. Now the way I have DotNetNuke set up is I'm going to access the website by navigating to http://dnndev. And I set that up as my development environment. As I mentioned earlier, the instructions for setting up that development environment are available on that shortcut URL, bit.ly/moduledev. Or if you just go to dotnetnuke.com and you click on the blogs link, at least as of right now, that is the latest blog post on the website. Later today, who knows, someone else might post a blog, so it might drop down on the list. But within that blog post, I have instructions for setting up that development environment. Now let me go ahead and just show you the website here real quick. And let me get the right window. And if I go ahead and refresh the page here, I basically have a .NET Nuke 6.1.5 installation running here at the URL DNNDev. Now, I set this website up this morning. I haven't bothered to license it, so it shows me I'm using a trial edition of .NET Nuke Professional Edition. That's fine. It's not going to cause any problems with our environment. I am logged in as the host or the super user account. Other than that, this is a clean installation of .NET Nuke 6.1.5 PE. I haven't made any changes, haven't created or deleted any pages, etc. But it is running locally at DNNDev as the URL. Now, in order to do module development within DNN, if we're using the WAP approach, or the Web Application Project model, I've created a couple of different templates that you can utilize. Now, templates are project templates that can plug into Visual Studio that just kind of pre-populate information as that project gets created within Visual Studio. Now, I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2010. You can use Visual Studio 2008. You can also utilize Visual Studio 2008 or 2010, the Express editions, the free versions that Microsoft provides. If you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to use 2010 just because it's the latest current public release, and that's the approach I'm going to go ahead and use. But like I said, you can use Visual Studio 2008. Now what we're going to do is we're going to download a template, and there's a Visual Basic template. There's also a C# template that are available on this URL. Now, all of these URLs mentioned here are linked within the shortcut URL, that module dev URL, that blog post I talked about earlier. So you don't need to worry about copying these down. As long as you got that blog post URL, you can find these other URLs. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to download the templates here from the CodePlex website. So the templates, if we go over here to CodePlex, and I'll wait for the screen to load up for everyone. There it goes. So from here, On CodePlex, this is Microsoft's kind of open source location for storing and maintaining projects. The templates are just another project on CodePlex. And there's a download option on the right side of the page. There's also a more and a view all downloads option. You can choose either of those. If you choose the download option, it will download the C# template. If you choose the more option, you can choose either C# or Visual Basic.NET. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the C# module development template. The Visual Basic template is essentially the same, just with VB instead of C#. It's really up to you as to how you want to do your module development. Now, one question that did come in here says, how are these templates different from the ones that you can download from the DotNetNuke website? So there are some templates within the DotNetNuke 6 starter kit. To be honest, I don't recommend that you use those because these templates work where those templates haven't been maintained and haven't been updated. I don't have a good reason as to why these templates are not the default ones. I can just tell you they are not. So I recommend utilizing these templates over the ones that you can get with the starter kit. So when you download the template, what you're going to get is a zip file, and I have the zip file highlighted here. In terms of the C# template, it is .NETNuke C# compiled module.zip. Now, in order to utilize the template, what we need to do is we need to copy that template, and we need to place this template into the appropriate folder. Now, if I go back to the slide deck here, I do have a section on the slide deck here that shows us which folder we need to put the templates into. So we're going to put the template into our My Documents folder. Within that, we should have a Visual Studio 2008 or a 2010 folder, depending on which version we have installed. From there, we're going to find a folder called Templates, and then Project Templates, and then Visual C#. Now, I'm installing the C# template. If you're installing the Visual Basic template, then you would find the VB folder. Now, within the Visual C# folder, you may or may not have a folder called Web, and we're going to go ahead and create that folder. So let me go ahead and navigate over to my Documents folder and get that pulled up here. So within the My Documents folder, I'm going to navigate into the Visual Studio 2010 folder. And like I said, all this information is documented within that blog post. So Visual Studio 2010, you're going to go into the Templates folder, and then Project Templates, and then Visual C#. Now in my case, in the Visual C# folder, I do not have a folder called Web, so I'm going to go ahead and create that. And then within the Web folder, I'm going to paste that .NETNuke C# compiled module.zip file. Now the template remains a zip file. You're not going to extract it. You're not going to make a folder out of it. You're just going to put it into this particular folder. Now if you want, you can go through and customize the templates. That's also documented within that blog post, or there's a link on how to customize templates within that blog post. So within here we have this .NETNuke C# compiled module folder, or zip file, excuse me, and that's now a project template that we're going to be able to utilize within Visual Studio. Before we can utilize this template, however, we need to do one additional thing. This template uses custom MS build scripts. Now MS build scripts are going to allow us to do some packaging for our module, which will then create zip files out of the module and make it so that we can easily install the module. In order to utilize those custom MS build scripts, though, we need to install an additional project. We need to install a project called the MS Build Community Tasks, and it's found at msbuildtasks.tigris.org. And I already have that URL opened here in a browser. And what we're going to do is on this page, down at the very bottom, you'll find a download the latest release option. And we can go ahead and click on the msbuild.community.tasks.msi link. So that MSI file is a file that you need to go ahead and download. Once you're done downloading it, you can go ahead and run the MSI file. So that'll go through and install the MS Build community tasks. Now you only need to do this the first time to get them installed. You don't have to go through and do this every time you want to create a project. But if you go ahead and finish that process, that will install those MS Build community tasks. Now I already had them installed, so it threw an error for me, but that's okay. I had already run through that process previously. Now, if you don't execute that MSI file and install the MS Build Community Tasks project, when you go to create a project based on this template, you're going to run into a problem. It'll throw an error telling you that it can't find something with a targets file, and you will not be able to create projects based on the template. So you want to be sure that you've downloaded and installed the MS Build Community Tasks project as well. Now, the reason you need this particular project is because of the automated build scripts that this module development template utilizes. Okay, so I've now taken the Visual C# template. I put it into my documents, templates, project templates, et cetera, folder. I've installed the MS Build Community Tasks. And as I said previously, if you want to customize the template, changing namespaces, changing company name, changing some of the basic information in that, you can do so. But you'll find a link within the bit.ly/module dev link in there for customizing those module development templates. Customizing the template requires that you extract all the contents, you make some changes, and then you zip that contents back up in order to create a new template. We're not going to get into that further here today, though. All right, so now that we have the template in place, and this goes for either the C# or the Visual Basic template, we can go ahead and create a project. Now, before I do so, let me make one mention here. Everything that we're doing here in today's scenario is we're creating a module that's going to be compatible with DotNetNuke 6.1.5. It will also be compatible with any newer versions of DotNetNuke that get developed. But because our development environment is set up using the latest version of DNN, this module is not backwards compatible. So if you need to develop modules for an older version of DotNetNuke, you would have to set up your development environment utilizing an older version of the platform. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. I recommend that you try to get upgraded to the latest release of DNN. With 6.1.5, you have the most up-to-date features, you have the most up-to-date security patches, and everything else included within the platform. So I would encourage you to go and try to get upgraded to DotNetNuke 6.1.5 if possible. I'll show you how to do that in our upgrades webinar coming up on May 2nd. For now, we're going to go ahead and create our project within Visual Studio. Now, I do not have Visual Studio open at this point in time. We'll open it up here in just a moment. You can utilize either 2008 or 2010. Then we're going to go in and we're going to create a new project, and I'll show you how to find our template that we just created or just installed. And when we create the project, we're going to give it a name. We're going to be very specific about the location where the project gets created. Now, the location for my development environment is going to be in C, Websites, DNN Dev. That's where I actually have my development website running. Now, within that, we're going to have a folder called Desktop Modules. That's the typical folder where modules go within DotNetNuke. Visual Studio will create a folder underneath of Desktop Modules based on the name of the project, or the module name that we provide. Now, also in Visual Studio, we're going to make sure that the Create Directory for Solution option is unchecked, and we're going to not add the project to source control to begin with. And then we'll go ahead and provide you an overview of the project itself. So let me go ahead and switch over to load up Visual Studio here. I'm going to load up Visual Studio 2010. Now, when I come into Visual Studio, I'm going to go into the File option, and I'm going to choose New Project. Now, it's important that you choose New Project, not New Website or Team Project or the other options. We're just going to choose New Project here. And within the Project window, because I'm using Visual C#, I'm going to make sure I have the Visual C# option selected on the left. and I'm going to choose the web folder underneath of Visual C#. Now once I choose web, you'll see over on the right side of the page now I have an option here called .NETNuke C# compiled module. That's the project template that we just installed. So we're going to select that. Now when we have that selected, down at the bottom we have an option for the name of our project. And I'm just going to call this one DNN Explained since it's part of our .NETNuke Explained development or webinar series. So that's the name of the project, and then I need to be very specific about the location of the project. This development approach that we're taking here works best when you place the modules into the desktop modules folder of your .NETNuke website. So in my case, that is C:/websites /DNNDev /desktop modules. So what will happen here is Visual Studio will create a folder inside of that location called DNN Explained. Now I'm going to pause here for a moment and cancel out of this window because I've got a comment here that just came in. This is actually a very common scenario. So the comment that came in says, my Visual Studio isn't allowing me to enter a location. And oftentimes you'll find that Visual Studio in some configurations will only allow you to define the name of the project, not the location. So if you run into that, I'll quickly show you how we can fix that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel here. I'm not going to create the project just yet. But in order to fix that option, if you do not have the location section, what you need to do is you need to go into your tools option in the tools menu. You're going to go to the import export settings section. And essentially what you need to do is you need to reset your environment in Visual Studio. So if you've made changes, you can export or you can import environment settings, but what I'm going to do is just choose the Reset All Settings option. I'm going to choose Next. I'm not going to save any of my settings. You can if you want to save the previous settings. That's up to you. I'm just going to choose the No option, then I'm going to choose Next. Now, after we go past that process, we get the option to choose our default collection of settings. The default collection of settings that you want to choose is the Visual C# Development Settings option. Even if you're doing your module development in Visual Basic, you want to choose this option. That's what will show you the location option. So choose Visual C# Development Settings, click on Finish, and then you can click on Close. Now if you come back in and you create a new project, you should get the location option again. Now, a comment here says, doesn't the general open up more options? I think the general is actually a problem that doesn't allow you to choose the location, but one of those options there, besides Visual C#, is the option that causes you not to get the location field. And that's going to be a problem. Makes it harder to do development for .NETNuke if you do not have the location option. So I'm going to come back in here and choose Visual C#. I'm going to choose Web, and I'm going to choose the .NETNuke C# compiled module project. I'm going to give the project the name, DNN Explained, and then I'm going to change my location again to Websites, DNN Dev, Desktop Modules. So that's the location where we want this project to be created. We want to make sure to uncheck the Create Directory for Solution option. What will end up happening if we uncheck that option, when this project gets created, Visual Studio is going to create a folder underneath of Desktop Modules called DNN Explained. It will also create a solution file called DNN Explained, and it will create a project file called DNN Explained. So we're going to have a project file and a solution file that exists within the same folder. If you had the Create Directory for Solution option checked, it would actually create two levels of folders, and our project would exist too far down in the folder structure. It's possible to live there, but you have to make some changes to the template. The template is configured very specifically for this particular scenario. So you can go ahead and create the project utilizing whichever framework you want within the new project window. You can use either .NET Framework 3.5 or Framework 4. It really, at this point, doesn't matter too much. Well, actually, I guess it would matter depending on how your application pool is configured. I think my application pool is currently configured for 3, so I'll go ahead and choose .NET Framework 3.5. And from here, we can go ahead and click on OK. Now this will go out and create our project inside of Desktop Modules. And it's going to take a moment here in Visual Studio as it loads up some information. Now this project template has quite a bit of information within it. The first thing we're going to see is once the project opens is we have this big kind of help documentation screen that loads up. So what you see is it says .NET Corporation, DNN explained, and then module has a heading here called important. And it essentially is going to walk us through a couple of steps that we need to do to our project in order to kind of finalize the project configuration. There are a couple of things that the Visual Studio templates will just not do. And we need to go ahead and account for those actions here. And they're documented here within these steps, 1 through 4, and then there's a couple of sub-steps as well. So essentially what we need to do is we need to come into our project now, which we can see over on the right side of the screen in the Solution Explorer. And I'll go over what's actually within the project here in a moment. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to right-click on the project, and we're going to choose Properties. We need to change a couple of the properties that are listed here in those steps, 1 through 4. So if we click on Properties, that's going to open up our Properties window. Within the Properties window, the very first tab is the Application tab. This shows us the assembly name. So when our project gets built, it will live in a file called dnnexplained.dll. The default namespace right now is .NETNuke.modules.dnnexplained. Now you could change this information if you needed to. This is all information that gets provided by that Visual Studio template. From there, if we click on the Build tab, what we'll find in the Build tab within the project, we don't actually need to make a change here, but within there, there's an Output section. And the output path for this particular project is a very specific path. It goes up 2 levels, so ... // and then bin. So what it's doing is when we build this project, it's going to put the DLL into the DNN dev bin folder. So the DLL will exist within the .NETNuke website's bin folder. And that's important so that .NETNuke knows where the module is and how to access the namespaces for this module. That's why the path or the location of our project was very important because of this output path. Now the thing we actually need to change is on the Web tab within the project properties. On the Web tab, if we go ahead and click on that option, there's a Start Action section. Here we need to choose the Start URL option. We're going to type in the URL, http://dnndev. That's the URL to our development environment. We also want to go ahead and change the servers section. Now, my development environment is set up using a local IIS web server. So I'm going to choose that option. And I'm going to choose the project URL, but it's not localhost /DNNexplained. The project URL is actually dnndev/desktopmodules/DNNexplained. And then we need to check the override application root URL option and once again set up DNNdev. So these are some options. These 3 changes that we made are options that we just can't get configured within the project template. So you have to make these changes when you first create your project. And they're documented back on that documentation page that loaded up for us. It's also documented in the instructions that you can find on that blog post I referenced earlier. And I'll pull that URL up again at the end of the session. So we've made these project property changes, changed the start URL to DNNDev, changed the project URL to DNNDev, desktop modules, DNN explained, and then we overrode the application root URL to DNNDev. Essentially what we've done here is we've set up our project so that we can hit F5 or we can start debugging our project and attach to the DotNetNuke website, which will then run our project. Now, one quick question that came in here. It says on the application page, which target framework should we be utilizing? It really depends on what website settings you have running. If you build a module that targets .NET Framework 3.5, it will run on .NET 4.0 without any problems. If you build a module that's targeting .NET 4, it will not run on 3.5. So you just have to keep in mind what your development and your production environments are going to be utilizing. So after I've made the changes to my project properties, I can go ahead and close the project file. Now I went ahead and I saved the file as well. Now, we've basically completed the steps 1 through 4 here. And the next option here is steps after your project is set up. We're going to go through and complete that here in just a moment. So let me switch back over to PowerPoint. And actually, before we go into the MS build, let's talk about the project itself. So let me go ahead and expand my Solution Explorer on the right side, and I'll tell you what's actually been created here within this project. All of this information was provided by that module development template that we utilized. So within our Solution Explorer, we have a top-level solution called DNN Explained. We have a single project within that solution, also called DNN Explained. Now within that, we have a properties folder that has a single assemblyinfo.cs file. If you were to open that, you would find it contains some of the information about our DLL. So when we build our project and a DLL gets built, that information comes out of this particular file. We can control version information, we can control other information, copyright information, descriptions, etc. within that assembly info file. From there, we have a references folder within Solution Explorer. Now there are 2 references in particular here that are .NET specific. There's a .NET reference that points to the .NET file. That exists within the website's bin folder. And then Microsoft.applicationblocks.data. That's Microsoft's enterprise library tools. Allows you to easily access SQL Server data. We're not going to get to that today, but that is referenced within the project templates. After that, we have a folder called App Local Resources that contains 3 RESX files. RESX files are resources that contain localization information or localized language files. We'll see those in action later on. We have a folder here called Build Scripts, which contains a module package.targets file and an MS Build Community tasks.targets file. These are the build scripts that are going to be utilized in order to package up our module. We'll see how to do that here in a few moments. There's a components folder that has a single class inside of here called Feature Controller. That class is utilized for creating things or interfaces within DotNetNuke such as iSearchable and iPortable and iUpgradable. We actually have some, if you go into that file and expand the collapsed region, you'll find there's actually some stubbed out examples within there, but it's mostly commented out code. Just included within the project, so you can include those within your own projects. And then we have a folder called Data. It has a dataprovider.cs file. It is our stubbed out abstract data provider. That matches up to our concrete data provider, which we'll see here in just a moment. From there is a documentation folder. Now the documentation folder contains that HTML file that we saw opened when we first loaded up our project. You can actually go ahead and remove that folder. We don't need the documentation folder anymore. It's just included so that when you first create the project, you know how to go through and configure those project properties. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it from our project. Now you could always utilize that for something else if you want to include other documentation about your module. Then we have a providers folder here. Now within the providers folder, there's actually two folders beneath that called data providers and then SQL data provider. Well, the common approach for module development in DotNetNuke is to utilize abstract and concrete data providers. And what that allows you to do is to build modules that can talk to different data sources. By default, most modules always talk to a SQL data source, SQL Server, because that's what DotNetNuke typically is installed on. But it is possible to develop your modules so that you can talk to an Oracle data source or other data sources as well. And that's where this provider model comes in. We're not going to get into data access today because we've got a lot of other things to cover here in the next 25 minutes. But I would encourage you to check out some of our other resources on the website. I have a Task Manager module development series which has a lot more information that you'll find about how to get in and start doing data access within your modules. From there, we have a file here called dnnexplained.dnn. This is the manifest file for our DotNetNuke module. If we open that, what we'll find is this manifest file is just an XML document, and this is the document that DotNetNuke is going to utilize to install the module. So we'll see this document get used here in a few moments when we package and install the module locally. We're not going to make any changes to this file today, but you could go through and start to make changes to your package. Now, there are two base classes within our project, DNN explained module base and DNN settings module, or excuse me, DNN explained settings base. Those are two base classes that are referenced by our user controls or our ASCX files found later in the project. Now, modules themselves are typically ASCX files, and what we find is we have three ASCX files within the project. We have an edit.ascx file, so that would be typically utilized if we were editing the content for our module. And the ASCX files right now, based on this project template, are essentially just empty files. If we open it up, you can see it just has the declaration at the very top, but there's no other code or content within the file. We'll come back and change that later on. The view control, view.ascx, is very similar to edit. It has the declaration at the top, but no actual content within it. And then we'll find the same things for the settings control, though the settings control actually has some stubbed out or commented out information on how to start utilizing settings within DotNetNuke, and we'll expose those here in a few minutes as well. Now, there are three other files within our project: a license.txt file, release notes.txt, and a module.css file. So within our module, we can start to include custom CSS for the module. We would include that within this module.css file. DotNetNuke will go through and reference that CSS file when our module is loaded on a page. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can get that module loaded on a page. In order to do that, though, we need to get the module installed. Now, utilizing this module development template, packaging and installing the module becomes very easy to do. That's why we use this template. That's why this template uses MS build scripts. So within the project, we saw that there's a build scripts folder, and those two scripts will basically go through and define what happens when we package, or how we package the module. Out of the box, the way this template works is when we package the module, it's going to create two different zip files. One zip file will be called install, and one will be called source. So the install is intended for installing in your production environment. It will have a DLL, it will have the ASCX files, and it will have the CSS files for your module. It will not include the code behind. It will not include the project or the solution file. The source package would include all that information. So the scripts are going to package that for us automatically, and once we package it, we'll find that it exists within desktop modules, in our case, DNN explained, and then there will be a folder called packages. Now let's go ahead and talk about how we actually do the packaging within this particular project template. And then I'll point out the item we have in bold here, which talks about changes. So we'll switch back over to our project. And packaging within the module is very easy to do. The way we're going to do packaging is up within our toolbars. We should have an option here to choose between debug or release mode. The way the build scripts are currently configured, they will only get executed when you build the module in release mode. Now, if you do not have the build and release or the debug and release options available to you in the toolbar, then you probably didn't run through the tools import-export settings step that we went through earlier. Using the C# environment, you get the debug and the release options. I believe using the Visual Basic environment, you do not get those options. So you actually have to go through and make some, I think you have to change your project properties in order to change how you're doing your builds. But utilizing C# here, all we have to do is select from that drop-down list, we're going to choose release. And then if we go to the build option within Visual Studio and we choose to build solution, now you could also use your keyboard and just press Control-Shift-B. That'll do a build. You can right-click over on the solution. You can choose Build Solution. You can press F6. There are a number of different ways to do the builds. But what happens when you do a build in release mode is we've actually now just gone out and created packages for our module. Now we need to find those packages so we can actually use them. So I'm going to go back to my file system now. And I'm currently on my C websites DNN dev folder. So that's my development environment. Inside of there I have a desktop modules folder. And inside of there I have a DNN explained folder. Now inside of the DNN explained folder I have a packages folder. And within there I have two zip files, one called DNN explained 000001 install, and then one's called source. So these are the two packages for this particular module. Now the version number, whoops, didn't mean to open it. The version number that's included in that file name comes from the assembly info file. So if we wanted to increase our version number, we could change the assembly info file. If we did another build in release mode, we would get a 002 install and a 002 source package. So this packaging, the creation of these two files occurred because of our build scripts back over in the build scripts folder within our solution. Now, I'm not going to go into details on how to modify the build scripts and things, what you can do with changes inside of the build scripts. You can do a lot of different things, but I will point out, if you make changes to a build script, and you can't just do a build right after that to see those changes take effect. You actually have to close the project in Visual Studio and you have to reopen the project in order to get Visual Studio to reload the build scripts. It's just a side effect of the way MS Build works in Visual Studio. So just keep that in mind if you do ever make changes to the targets files. But for now, we have those two packages. So what we're going to be able to do with those packages is go back to our development website and install the module. So I've loaded up my development URL here. I'm doing a refresh right now. It's going to take a moment for that page to reload. Now the reason it's going to take a moment is we've actually gone out and we've compiled our module. That puts a DLL into the bin folder of our website. Even though DotNetNuke doesn't know anything else about the module currently, doesn't know it exists, but the code for that module does exist. So that causes our application to recycle. It takes a moment when the page reloads. What we want to do now is we want to install our module. Once we've installed it, we can then place it on a page. Well, the installation of an extension is managed from the host extensions page. So I'm going to mouse over host within the control panel, and I'm going to click on the extensions option. That'll take us to that host extensions page. Now from the host extensions page, we're going to mouse over the Manage button on the extensions page, and we're going to choose the Install Extension Wizard. So this would be how you would upload any module that someone has developed for you or you've purchased and you've got a zip file for that module, any module that you've custom developed or any skin that you've custom developed. We're going to choose the Install Extension Wizard. That'll bring up a window here which will then allow us to browse for our installation or source package. So we're going to go ahead and click on the Choose File option, and then I'm going to browse to my C, Websites, DNN Dev, Desktop Modules, DNN Explained, and then Packages folder. So I'm going to browse to the file where I know the packages for my module exist. Now the packages for my module exist in that packages folder, and I can now choose to install either the source or the installation version. At this point, it really doesn't matter if I install the install package or the source package. Because the source already exists on the file system, it's still going to be there when we install it. I'm going to go ahead and choose the source package as my zip file, and then step through the installation process. Click on Next, and that takes us to the package information screen, which provides us some basic information about our package, which tells us the name is DNN Explained. It's a module, has a friendly name, has a description, some version information, some email address and organization information. All of that information comes out of the .dnn file. Now let me point out one thing that I forgot to mention when I talked about my development environment. I told you I had a clean installation of DotNetNuke Professional version 6.15, and that was true. But one thing I failed to mention earlier was in my development environment, I did make a modification to the web.config file specifically for development. And that modification I've made was called Show Missing Keys. What that allows me to do is in my development environment, when I set show missing keys equal to true, this is documented within the development environment instructions I'll show you the link to later on, it will turn on the localization features of DotNetNuke. And what that ends up causing is anytime DotNetNuke pulls up a local resource file or a local resource string, it puts a L in square brackets in front of whatever that string is. So you'll see all throughout my page here I have these L with square brackets in front of it. So where it says name here, it has an L with a square bracket. Type, friendly name, etc. So I would only do that in a development environment. But what that allows me to do is to show portions of the page that are properly being localized. What that allows me to do is to create a module and see within that module which strings are localized so that if someone wanted to take my module and provide a Spanish translation for that module, any string that's localized could be localized in a Spanish language pack. So the show missing keys just makes it easier to see where the localized strings are coming from. We'll see that here in a few moments. So let's go ahead and click on Next. We get our release notes. Now that module development project there with the release notes.txt file really doesn't have much information in it right now, just has some generic info that gets displayed on the screen. We're going to click on Next again. We then get a license here that provides us a default license that's included within the project. You could always change that. You do have to accept the license when you install it. So we'll go ahead and click on Accept and then click on Next. Now, DotNetNuke is going to take the zip file that we just uploaded. It's going to take all of the contents of that zip file and put them into the appropriate folders. Now, we essentially just uploaded the module to our development environment again. So we really overwrote everything that was already in our development environment for this particular module. In our case, that doesn't change anything. It doesn't affect anything. It just overwrites files with the same files that were already there. From here, we can go ahead and click on Return, and that'll take us back to the host extensions page. Now, it's going to take a moment for the host extensions page to load up. Because we just installed the module, we just put new files into the system, it takes a sec to recycle. But now that we have the module installed, if we scroll down on our extensions page, we should find DNN explained listed. We have a description, we have a version number. Now we don't currently have that module on a page, but that's what we're going to go ahead and do next. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a page that we can place our module on. Now I typically in my development environments create an individual page for each module I'm working on. Rather than taking the module and placing it on the home page or taking a module and placing it on an existing page, I will come in and I'll create a new page for that module. So the way I'm going to do that is mouse over the Pages option in the control panel. I'm going to choose the Add New Page section, and I'm going to create a page called DNN Explained. I'm not going to choose a template. So instead of default, I'm going to choose the blank option, which in our case, the blank option actually has the language token in front of it. And I'm not going to worry about the insert section right now. I'm just going to click on Add Page. That will create a new page called DNN Explained that has no modules currently on it. So we have an empty page here. We see it now in the menu. And the reason I created a page for this module is if the module throws any errors, that way I don't break anything else. If anything, I break a page that I'm using just for testing of this particular module. Now we want to place the module on a page. We're going to do so by mousing over the Modules option in the control panel. We're going to choose from the category selection, we're going to choose all categories. And within the list, we're going to go ahead and choose DNN Explained from the drop-down list of modules. Now we can go ahead and give the module a title if we wish. We could change the visibility, change the location, but I'm simply just going to choose Add Module to add it to the page. So once we've dropped the module on a page here, we can see the module title, DNN Explained. We have a blue box here that tells us visible by administrators only. Well, that's because of our page permissions that are currently defined. There's no actual content being displayed within the module. If we mouse over the Manage button, we do have an option here for Edit Module. So what's happening right now is when we place the module on a page, the view control for that module is being loaded on the page. If we were to mouse over the Manage button and click on the Edit Module option, then the edit control for our module will be loaded on the page. And finally, if we moused over the Manage button, clicked on Settings, we would see that we can access the settings for our module. Well, let's go ahead and see how we can actually provide some content and some functionality within that module so that we can see what the view control does, what the edit control does, and what the settings control does. So I'm going to switch back to Visual Studio. We can make changes now that we have the project and the module installed. Now when I switch back to Visual Studio for this first time, I'm going to get a warning here that says file modification detected. It tells me the solution has been modified outside of Visual Studio. That occurred because we installed the module into DNN. It essentially overrode everything that was already on the file system. So we're going to go ahead and just click on Reload. Visual Studio will go back and reload the solution. Doesn't really cause a problem there, but it does reload. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want to make sure that I don't package the module every time I do a build. So I'm going to change back from release into debug mode within the module. And let me go ahead and close the windows I currently have open in Visual Studio so we can start with just the view control. So within the view control, I'm going to open up view.ascx.cs. Now within here, I can start making changes to this ASCX file. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just simply type in the words view control. And I'm in the source view within view.ascx. I could switch to the design view if I want to. I prefer to work in the source view. But if I add those two words and I save the ASCX file, I'm not going to do a build. I'm not going to do anything else. I just saved the ASCX file. But if I switch back to my browser now and I refresh the browser, we'll find that the words view control now show up on the page. So all we did was we made a change to the ASCX file, saved the change, and it was immediately available on our DotNetNuke development website. Now, that's because we made a change to the ASCX file. If we made a change to the code behind the .cs file, that would still require us to do a build. Now, if I switch back over to our project, I'm going to go ahead and open up our edit.ascx file, and I'm going to type in edit control into that ASCX file. I'm also going to go into the settings.ascx file, and before the comments that are there, I'm going to add in settings control. So I edited 2 additional ASCX files, edit.ascx, settings.ascx. Save both of those files, switch back to my browser, and now I want to access those 2 controls. Well, the way this particular module is set up, I can access the edit control by mousing over the manage button for the module and choosing edit module. And that will load up our edit control. It loads it up within this modal pop-up window. We can see the word edit control. So anything we put in the edit control, be it a drag and drop element like a grid view or a data source or anything else, a label, we can drag and drop anything into our controls within Visual Studio, just like you can any other ASP.NET project. You're just dealing with ASCX files as opposed to ASPX files. So DotNetNuke has one ASPX file. It's default.aspx. Everything else within DNN are just user controls that get embedded within DNN, within that ASPX file. So that's our edit control. We can also access the settings control by mousing over that manage button again and clicking on the settings option. Now, when we go to the module settings, the first thing we're going to see within module settings are tabs across the top here. There's module settings, permissions, page settings, and we'll find those 3 tabs exist on any type of module. Doesn't matter if it's DNN explained or the HTML module or a forum module or a blog module. Every module has those first 3 tabs. What every module may or may not have is the 4th tab. And we see here, if we click on that 4th tab, it's currently titled DNN Explained Settings. And if we click on that, it shows us settings control, the word that we typed into our settings control. So we can then access our settings control just like we did our edit and our view controls. Now, we don't have any settings currently defined there. That's okay. We're going to go ahead and add a setting here real quick. And before I do that, let me just switch over to PowerPoint, make sure we're catching the right options here. So in PowerPoint, we've got a title here, making our module sing. Let's go ahead and actually make our module do something besides just display text within our ASCX files. So we're going to add a module setting to our settings control, and then we're going to utilize that setting within our view control. And I'll show you how to do that here. We probably won't get into localization here as we're just about out of time. We're going to run over time as it is. So let me go ahead and go through and show you how to access the settings here real quick, how to utilize those settings, and then we'll dive into our Q&A. And there's a lot of questions here that I've got to go through. So I'll try to get to those here in just a moment. So to utilize our settings control, what I'm going to go ahead and do is navigate back to the settings.ascx file. And within that ASCX file, I'm going to go ahead and remove the comments that were hiding some of that code there that was all marked in green within the ASCX file. Now, what uncommenting actually does is it brings in a registration to a DotNetNuke label control, which can be found within the DNN dev website in the controls folder, and then a file called labelcontrol.ascx. Now, you may or may not get that highlighted in blue or green text telling you that it can't find it. Sometimes Visual Studio doesn't realize where that file is, even though it exists within the DotNetNuke website. In most cases, that's okay. It won't cause you any problems actually doing a build. But what we have is that label control is going to be then utilized down below on the page, or on the ASCX file. Now, what's currently within this ASCX file is we have a heading tag here, or an H2 tag, that has an ID, has a class around it called DNN form section head, and then a hyperlink here for essentially this is going to be a collapsible heading. And then using the DotNetNuke form pattern, we have a field set and then a couple of divs here. Within the divs, we have a label for setting 1 and a text box for setting 1. And we have a label for setting 2 and a text box for setting 2. And if we were to switch to design view, you really don't see anything when you switch to design view. You see the text boxes, but that's just the way it shows up here in design view for DNN. That's okay. What we need to do, though, in order to utilize those settings is we need to manage the code behind for our module, or for our settings control. So if we expand on the right side in our Solution Explorer, if I expand the settings control, we find that there's a settings.ascx.cs file. If I go ahead and open that, this is the code behind for our settings control. Now, the settings control is unique in that it does not have a page load method. In order to have your module settings loaded within the standard DotNetNuke module settings interface, you have to implement a method called load settings and a method called update settings. And what we'll see here is we've got comments within those two methods that we can go ahead and uncomment if we want to utilize the settings. So what we're going to go ahead and do is remove this first comment that says uncomment to load saved settings into the text box, and I'm going to remove the closing comment that was wrapping around that. And what's going to happen here is inside of our load settings method, we come in and we check inside of the DotNetNuke module settings. Module settings are available to us as a hash called settings, or hash table, excuse me. So there's a hash table called settings, and what we're doing here is we're saying if this settings hash table contains a setting called setting 1, we want to take the value from that table, and for that setting, we're going to set that to our text box. So we have a text box called text setting 1. We set the text attribute on it to whatever the value is for that setting. We do the same thing for setting 2. Checks if there's a setting 2 that exists. If so, we spit the value out into the text box. Now the update settings method is going to get called when the module settings are updated. So load settings get called when the settings control gets loaded on the page. Update settings gets called when someone clicks save or clicks update to the settings. Well, updating or saving a setting is pretty straightforward. We're going to use a module controller within DNN. Now the namespace for that is .NetNuke.entities.modules, and it's already included up above. But accessing this module controller, we then have access to a method called update module setting. That method takes in an argument called module ID. That's available to us from our base class, so we don't have to, as developers, worry about what the module ID is. DNN provides that information for us. We pass in the name of our setting. We pass in the value of whatever the setting is that we want to save. We do the same thing for setting 2. So we're essentially just coming in and going and saying, take the text value from the text box and create or update a setting called setting 2. Create an update called setting 1. All right, so let's go ahead and save our change here. Because we've now made changes to the code behind, in order for those settings to actually work, we need to come in and we need to do a build. So from the build menu, I can choose build solution. We should get a build succeeded down at the bottom. And if we go ahead and switch back to our browser, and I'm going to go ahead and close the window that was open in the browser to refresh the page, we need to access those module settings once again. So it's going to take a moment to do because we just did a build. Once it's reloaded, we can come back into the Manage button. We can choose Settings from the Manage button. That will load up our module settings. If we go to the 4th tab, we see the DNN Explained settings. And then we have a label here that says Setting 1. We have a label that says Setting 2. And when we mouse over those labels, we get this little blue help text that pops up. It says put your value here, or value for setting 1 here, and put your value for setting 2 here. That information, setting 1 spelled out, and the help text is found within the local resource files, the localization files. So what we can do is go ahead and provide the settings. So I'm just going to type in setting 1 is Chris, setting 2 is Hammond, just for some sample text here. If I go ahead and click on Update, those settings will be saved. The module settings window goes away. Our view control reloads. Nothing changes. Well, that's because we aren't doing anything in our view control currently. But we can go ahead and double check that the settings were saved by navigating back to the settings control in the Manage button. And when the page loads back up, we should see the settings that I typed in get populated into the control. So now we can actually do something with those settings, and just for simplicity's sake, what I'm going to do is go back to Visual Studio. I'm going to go into my view control, and within the view control, I'm going to drag an ASP label onto the view control. Now, out of the box, that gives us an ID of label 1, run at equal server, text equal label. I'm going to remove the text option. And what I'm going to do is just leave it as ASP:label ID label 1, run at equal server. And then in the code behind for that control, so the code behind for view.ascx.cs, I'm going to come in and I'll find a page load method. So within the view control and within the settings control, you'll find page load. Page load is pretty standard across ASP.NET applications. Within the page load, you'll find something very specific to DNN. It's got a try catch, but it's got a catch that's catching a system exception, and it's passing it to a handler called process module load exception. That's found within the .NETNuke.services.exceptions namespace. So what this allows is if your module throws an error for any reason, .NETNuke will catch the error and handle that error. It'll save it in the event viewer or the event log within the database. Under the admin event viewer page, you'd be able to see the details for that particular error. But if we come into this page load within the try, what we're going to do is we're just going to come in and say label1.text equals, and we're going to pull in our settings. So label1.text is standard ASP.NET information right there. We're setting it equal to our settings hash table, and we can set it equal to the setting called setting 1. Now, because we're pulling that from a hash table, we'll go ahead and do a toString on the end of it. And if I put a semicolon on the end, I'll go ahead and save the file and do a build. What's going to happen is when this page loads, .NETNuke is going to go out and look for setting 1 and set that value to the label. Switch back to the browser. refresh the browser, and we should see that setting populated on the page. Now we can do that with both settings. It'll take a moment to reload because we just did a build, but it'll do that for the first setting. We could also do it for additional settings if we wanted to. Now I'm going to show you one more thing before we dive into the Q&A, because there's a lot of questions here, but I do want to show you how we can go through and debug if we need to within .NETNuke. Debugging in .NETNuke using this particular development environment that I talked about today is very easy. So we're going to set a breakpoint over on the left here for this label.txt setting. I set the breakpoint by clicking on that column, set the red dot there. From here, I can go to the debug option within Visual Studio and start debugging. Now, the first thing we're going to see is Visual Studio throws an error here. Well, that's because I have not modified the web.config file to enable debugging. So that's pretty straightforward. We can do that, but we have to do that now back in the root of our .NETNuke website. So for your development environment in C, Websites, DNN Dev, we're going to open the web.config file. And if we search within the web.config file, there's an option for compilation debug equal false. We're going to set that to true. So you have to do this in your development environment. You wouldn't do this in a production environment, but you would set this to debug equal true in development. And now if we go back to our code behind here and try our debug again, choose debug, start debugging. It's going to take a moment. It'll actually compile the module, compile the project, and it will load up a new tab or a new browser here. And it's going to access http://dnndev. That's because that was the start URL that we defined within the project properties. Once that loads up, we can simply navigate to the DNN explained page. And as soon as we do, we hit the breakpoint there within Visual Studio. So at this point, we can do anything we can do within a standard ASP.NET web application for debugging. I can hit F11 to step into it or F10 to step over it and just go through the process. So I can set the breakpoint wherever I need to. Now for here, I'll just hit F5. That'll tell it to continue. And then that page loads up again within our browser. All right, so we've covered a lot of information today. There's a lot more information about our .NETNuke module development. I'd encourage you to check out some of the other training options that we have. I will pull up the initial page that I had with the URL. For those of you who need the URL to that blog post I mentioned a couple times today, check out the blog post. It's at bit.ly/moduledev, all lowercase. That'll take you to my latest .NETNuke.com blog post that has links to the templates, links to the MS Build installation files. It has a link to setting up your development environment. That's the one thing we didn't go through today. I just provided you an overview of what I had set up. That environment is very specific. It works very well when you get it set up. I would encourage you to try to follow that model as closely as possible. It does require a couple of changes, but those changes are all documented within the blog post there, the links there, so you can get it set up and running. We utilized the project templates that I showed you on CodePlex. The link is within that blog post as well, and then we went through, created our project and package, etc. One other thing you'll find within that module dev blog post, I believe there is a link there to the Task Manager module development series that we've created. It's currently a 25-part video series, all 5 to 10-minute videos on how to go through the process of doing module development for DNN. It's a lot more detailed than what we covered here today. I'd encourage you to check that out. It covers a lot more just because there's more time within that to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to our questions. So I'll try to go ahead and start answering your questions in the order that they were asked. If you have additional questions, please feel free to go ahead and type those in, and I will try to get to those. All right, so let me go ahead and I'll read through these and then try to come up with an answer as we go. First question is, can you embed one module inside of another? For example, I have a small registration form module embedded in an HTML module, so I can have the HTML module text float around the survey. Simple answer to that is yes. You can embed other modules, or you can embed ASCX files within modules. Everything within DNN, as I previously stated, essentially are ASCX files. So modules are ASCX files. Skins are ASCX files. Within your own modules, you can embed other ASCX files. And that's what that label control was doing when we saw the DNN label on the settings control. So you can embed other things within your modules. Question here says, I have two modules that I would like to merge or combine. Does DNN allow for such workability? If so, where would I find the details? Details for that, I can't really point you to anything for how to go through and merge or combine modules. What I would recommend, though, is you essentially have to manually go through and create a project and include whatever functionality or code from each of the two modules into one project would be the approach that I would basically go through. Question here says, I'm new to DNN. I have installed DNN at localhost. How do I replace the Awesome Cycles pages with new pages that I want to develop? For that, I would actually point you to our portal administration webinar from a couple weeks ago. The recording for that is available. Also, look for our content edit and updates webinar coming up on May 22nd. That's really outside of the scope of our session here today, but you can start going through creating new pages or deleting old pages, and that portal admin webinar shows you how to start doing that. Let's see here. One of the questions here says, in the manifest file, where can I define the category name? Is category name supported in the new manifest structure? And as far as I know right now, you cannot include the category information in your manifest. You can only do that after a module is installed. Question here says, are modules we will be creating today backward compatible with .NET version 5.6? In the environment that we have set up right now, no. These modules would only work in .NET 6.1.5 or later versions of DNN. If you want to develop against older versions, you'd have to set up an older environment. Everything we did in this session is not specific to .NET 6. That just happened to be the environment that I set up. So all the code that we wrote would work in .NET 5 or even .NET 4 potentially. All right, let's see what the other questions are here. So the next question here, also I'd point you back to the portal admin course, is since we run multiple websites inside of one DNN installation, is it necessary for all the sites to use the same DNN database? Or can we have different databases for different sites? If you want to have multiple sites within one installation, then they're all going to share one database. If you want to have multiple sites that each have their own database, then you just do multiple installations of DNN. Another question here says, can you get the template for the project via NuGet? As of right now, you cannot, but I'll look at seeing how we can get the template out there into the NuGet project to try to get that included. Question here says, would you be able to use this method to upgrade an existing custom module that was built for .NET 4? You couldn't really create a new project based on the template for your existing module without manually copying or moving all that information over. But depending on the code and how complex it is, copying or moving that information over might not be too difficult to do. That would probably be easier than going through and adding all the information into an existing project and converting it to DNN 5 or DNN 6. So I would recommend or suggest that you start with the template if possible to try to convert any older modules. Let's see. If we were using VB.NET instead of C#, question is, what would we see in the installed templates pane? Instead of seeing .NET C# compiled module, it would have been .NET VB compiled module, I believe. Question here says, is there a difference between the name of the project and the name of the solution? Essentially, no. They're both the approach that I've gone through today. We should leave them both. Sorry, they should both be the same name. You could always rename the solution if you want to, but for most modules, you're just going to leave them the same. Question here says, in case you don't want to create DLL files and you just want to go with the WSP approach to development, how would you do it? Essentially, you just start going through and adding ASCX files into your .NET Nuke website project. I personally would not recommend the WSP approach to your development. It's just not a clean way. It's not an easy way to manage and source control and version files. You can, but I would steer you to the WAP approach for your module development. Another question here is, what version of the enterprise library is used in the references? Right now, within .NET Nuke, it still ships with a very old version of the Microsoft Enterprise Library. I think it's version 2 to be specific. Question here says, sometimes when I add a reference to Telerik controls and then when I install my module in production, I get an error. If you have to be careful when you're developing against Telerik controls in .NET Nuke that you're utilizing the same Telerik controls that .NET Nuke ships with. .NET Nuke, at least with version 6.14, I don't know if it changed in 6.15, shipped with the Q4 2011 Telerik controls, not the 2012 controls. So you need to be careful about that. Question here says, I have source code for an existing module which I have to edit. The changes I make to the code do not seem to have an effect on the website. What do I have to set up in order to see the live code? I'm trying to avoid having to package the module after every little change in development. If you're making changes in development and you want to deploy those to production, you're going to need to go through and package and deploy the module. Otherwise, you have to copy the DLL or copy the ASCX files that change. To be honest, I would recommend the packaging approach, just doing the zip files to make those changes and have them deployed. Now, if you're making changes in development and you're not seeing those changes, then you need to look at where the DLLs are being built. If they're not being built into the proper directory, then .NET Nuke wouldn't pick those up. Another question here says, can you define a second view control within a module? You can add additional ASCX files. In order to get DNN to reference those, you would have to include those within the .NET Nuke manifest file, the DNN file as well. Question here says, my build script install failed. It said I needed the .NET Framework 2.0. If you're installing the MS Build community tasks and it didn't install because it says you don't have .NET 2.0, I'd recommend trying to check and see if you can install .NET Framework 2.0 as well. I don't think it's an option. Maybe it is, but I don't think it's an option to even have 4.0 installed without 2.0. Maybe it is on newer versions of Windows, but I'd check that out first. Question here says, when I type DNN dev into my browser, it doesn't find the site and it transfers me to Google. When I open up IIS Manager and browse the site, it opens up fine using localhost. That would be correct. That's because you haven't set up your development environment with the instructions that I link in that blog post. In order to access DNN dev as your URL, you have to make some changes that are documented in that blog post. Question here says, are there templates available for older versions of DNN if upgrading DNN is not possible? On that project page, the Codeplex page, there are some older versions of the template. I honestly don't remember which versions of DNN I built templates for. There were some for at least 5.6. I don't know if I have anything older than that or not. So unfortunately, I really can't help you out too much there. I really would highly suggest trying to upgrade if possible. We are here in the next couple months, we're basically no longer going to be doing any releases on the 5.x platform. And for the past year, all we've done are security fixes for 5.6. I think we're up to 5.6.6 or 5.6.7 currently. Question here says, to use the DNN controls, such as DNN label, what needs to be added to get the IntelliSense for these controls? For the most part, the IntelliSense for the DNN label control and some of the other controls within DNN should work out of the box. It really depends on your environment, though. I've seen some instances of Visual Studio where they just never work. Doesn't matter what you do. Other times it'll just work right out of the box. If you follow this approach where you have the website set up as DNN Dev and you have the project within Desktop Modules module name, for the most part it should work every time. Question here says, I'm seeing changes to my ASCX files reflected on the site, but not changes to the code behind, even after a build. That tells me that your build is building to the wrong location, which probably means when you created the project that the project was created inside of a directory within inside of another directory. So you would have to change the build path, or you would either start over and create a new project without having that create directory for solution option checked. That's the most common culprit when you have that problem. Another question says, will this video be posted? This video will be posted on our website later today. We'll send out a link tomorrow with the information on accessing the video. Question here says, do you have any examples of client-side binding or client-side binding with the Teleric controls? I don't currently, but I would encourage you to check out some of the blog posts from our engineers over the past month or two. There is a lot of information out there about doing binding with projects like knockout.js and web services. So there's a lot more information coming about that with .NET Nuke 6.2. Question here says, image file referencing. I've created an images folder within my module, but I'm having trouble referencing the images from the view.ascx file, referencing source and then resolve URL / images. This doesn't work. However, okay, so typically, I'm not going to read the whole question here, but typically the problem with referencing paths for images within .NET Nuke is a module can live at a variety of different locations. And when it's loaded on a page, that page might have a different URL structure than a different page. And because of that, you have to be very specific when you reference images. If you have images within your module, those images exist within desktop modules / module name / images. Well, if you just reference them as images without the desktop modules and module name, you're going to run into path issues, because depending on where your website is or where that module is loaded on the website, the paths will differ because they're essentially relative. So what you want to do is you want to have a full absolute reference to your images, typically using desktop modules / module name / images. And if you do include those within the images folder, specifically a folder called images, they should be included within the package for the module, but that's because the targets file, the MS build script for that module, is supposed to grab everything out of the images folder. If you put them into a different folder called pics or something else, they would not be picked up because the build script isn't looking for that. You'd have to make changes to the build script. All right, let's see what else we got here. Another question here about the localization option with the L showing up or not showing up in front of your information. The way I have the localization turned on within my website is in the web.config file, the setting called show missing keys. So if you want to turn on the show missing keys option to show that localized token, you want to change the setting called show missing keys from false to true. Question here about the unable to start debugging on the web server. That'll happen if you haven't modified the web.config file like I showed you. So you need to modify your web.config file to enable debugging before you'll be able to debug the project. And I believe that's also documented in my environment blog post and the wiki page for that. Question here says, when you install in production, do you need to install the DLL that was made in the bin folder, or does uploading the install package take care of that? Uploading the install package takes care of all of that for you. So installing in production, you just upload the install zip file and it'll do the rest. Question here says, is DNN planning to provide any framework for IMC on the client side? So there is some client-side functionality coming, like I said, with or a lot more coming with DotNetNuke 6.2. I'd encourage you to check out some of those blog posts from IMC. I'm assuming you're referring to intermodule communication. I don't know of anything on the client side that's being planned for that right now. That's not to say there isn't, though. Question here says, is there any framework for accessing settings on the client side? There is not currently, but like I said, there's a lot more coming with 6.2 and then the major release after 6.2 in terms of web services and features there. Question here says, is there an MVC3 module template project? Currently, no. You can't actually use MVC for module development within .NET or it's very difficult to do so. We do have some new MVC functionality coming out with 6.2, though, for the services aspect. So we're creating essentially a services layer, which you can create MVC-based projects for. Another question here says, how can I create multiple views in one module, like in the blog module? So the way the blog module works is it actually has multiple what we'll call module definitions, and that would require you having multiple definitions within the manifest file. Easiest way to explain that is to point you to the blog project, download the source code for that, and you can open up the manifest file for the blog module and check that out. That's the best way in a lot of cases to learn more about module development, is to download the source for modules that you've already used or you like and check out how those are developed. Question here says, I'm running DNN from a web hosting solution at GoDaddy. I notice if I don't access the site for 3 minutes, it takes extremely long to load. What can I do to fix this? First off, I would, and this is my personal opinion here, would never host anything at GoDaddy. I'm a huge customer of GoDaddy. I have way too many domains with them. I spend way too much money a month a year with them, but I do not do any hosting there. Their hosting service has always been extremely poor when it comes to .NET, so I would not encourage you to use GoDaddy. That being said, there are some kind of keep alive services that are out there. .NET is an ASP.NET application, and one of the features of IIS is it will stop an ASP.NET application if it hasn't had any requests. The default is 20 minutes, so I'm not sure why you're seeing it in 3 minutes. Maybe GoDaddy has that changed. But you can have a keep alive that will basically hit your website every X number of minutes and make sure that it's always up and running within IIS so that it doesn't get unloaded. Question here says, is .NET free? That depends on the edition. There's a free community edition, there's a paid professional and enterprise editions of .NET. And the professional and enterprise editions have extended features. We actually have a .NET Professional Edition webinar tomorrow. I'd encourage you to sign up for that if you're looking for more information on those. Question here says, what is the preferred language for module development, C# or VB? Ultimately, that's up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. I started out doing all my development in Visual Basic. I have since switched and do all my development now in C# except for one project, which I still maintain in Visual Basic just because I've been too lazy to go through and convert it all. So it really is up to you as a developer to choose if you want to do C# or VB. Question here says, instead of installing DNN on our development workstations, can we have DNN on a dedicated development environment or web server and still be able to deploy, run, and debug? Technically, yes, but it's going to become very difficult, very time-consuming to get that environment set up and running. Any issues you run into can be difficult to track down, so I would encourage you to try to go with a local approach. That's the recommended approach for doing development. Question here says, do you know of any good resources or books to continue learning? Example, to connecting with the database, using SQL Server, etc. Well, the first thing I'd point you to is that Task Manager series I mentioned earlier. Let me go ahead and pull up the URL again to my blog post. And if you check out there, the Task Manager series is linked there. I'd also encourage you to take a look at some of our paid training options. We do have a 16-hour module development course, which goes into a lot more detail than we do here in this hour and a half that we've had today. Question here says, do the custom MS build scripts update the DNN manifest file with any new files or resources you add to the module project? Currently, no. The MS build script doesn't make any changes to the .dnn file. I've looked at or thinking about looking into how to make changes for the version information, but I haven't done that at this point. All right, see, there's a lot more questions here. I'm trying to get through them as quickly as I can. I thank you for everyone who's had questions so far today. Question here says, is there an existing DNN module that I need to add a field in as per my website's requirements? How can I do so? You're going to have to clarify that question because I'm really not sure where you're going with that question. Question here is, which controls are preferable to use, ASP.NET controls or the DNN controls? Example, ASP label or DNN label. It really depends on what you're trying to provide. If you're providing form fields and you want to utilize the help text features, the DotNetNuke label control provides more features over the standard ASP label. Mousing over it shows you that help text. Other than that, it really is up to you which ones you want to use. Question here says, we use VB, but when you were changing the import and export settings wizard, did you say that you always use Visual C# development settings? Yes, I do, because that just changes the environment. It actually doesn't change your development, the code, what you write. It just changes the toolbars, the way things are presented, and it gives you that debug or release mode option. It gives you some of the other options that you don't get always with Visual Basic. Question here says, are there any settings or specific settings for a project including both C# and VB modules? Well, typically, the project itself would be Visual Basic or C#. I don't know if you can really mix the two within an individual project. You could have a solution that had C# projects and Visual Basic projects, and they're just individual modules at that point, or individual projects, so it really doesn't matter. Another question here says, what are the advantages of using C websites DNN dev as opposed to C inetpub www root DNN dev? Really, the only advantage there is one less directory to type. Oh, it's simply a matter of preference. I prefer to keep everything I run inside of C websites. Just makes it easy for me to find. inetpub www root oftentimes is the local host website, and having other websites running within an existing website sometimes can get a little tricky. Question here kind of goes back to the previous question. Says, is it possible or complicated to use an IIS server on a separate computer and still debug and step through? Possible, yes. Difficult, yes. Question here says, can you explain why DNN is choosing web parts versus ASCX controls? So I'm not really sure what you're referencing there. DNN does use ASCX controls. Web parts are typically SharePoint projects that you can include, and they're similar to modules within DNN, but modules, like I said earlier, are just ASCX controls within DotNetNuke that you can load in. Question here says, if my ASCX file logic performs view, add, modify, and delete functionality, is that possible in DNN as opposed to having a view ASCX, an add ASCX, and an edit ASCX, or a delete? You can do it all within one control within DNN, no problem. The abstraction that we use in this particular project template are really just to kind of make it easier to find, easier to track down. But putting everything in one file is completely possible in DNN. Question here says, can these modules be applied to DNN Community Edition? So yes, if you're developing against Professional Edition, you can still deploy the module against Community Edition and vice versa. Some question here, looks like someone's getting an error message about debugging. If you don't have IIS running a website at DNN dev, then you probably won't be able to attach to it and debug. What I would suggest is you might try just using the attach to process option in Visual Studio and attach to your existing IIS website if you want to try debugging there as well. And let's see. Question here, what's the difference between SharePoint and DNN? There's a lot of differences. I can't really go into that in today's session. And do you have any examples of the entity framework with DNN modules? I don't currently. I know there have been some projects to use entity framework. I think one of our core team members, Steve Fabian, has been doing a blog series utilizing the entity framework. So I encourage you to check out Steve Fabian's blog on .NetNuke.com. Click on the blogs link, and on the left, look for Steve. I think he was doing some entity framework stuff. And then looks like the question back to the SharePoint from previous says, with web part connections, there's web part connection. Is there similar functionality with user controls? So if you're tying into data access, if that's what you're referring to, there is similar functionality within user controls. For that, I'd encourage you to check out the Task Manager series. And you can find that, like I said previously, from this bit.ly module dev URL, which will take you to my latest blog post on .NetNuke.com. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending today. We had a lot of questions. Hopefully I got as many of those as possible answered. And thank you guys for attending. We will get the video processing for this, hopefully have it up on the website later today. You'll be able to easily find that from the video library under the resources page. You'll also get a link in an email later today with information about that. So thanks again for attending, and I look forward to seeing you in our upgrade webinar coming up in a couple of weeks.